Hey everyone, welcome to Lecture 2. Now that you've got a basic background in elements, let's put some of these elements together to make compounds and molecules. There are three bond types that are important in our class: ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. You remember that ions are charged atoms like this sodium, which easily loses its valence electron to become positively charged, and chloride, which easily gains an electron to become negatively charged. Ions are attracted to each other, but generally their electrons circle only their own nucleus. When ions bind together, they form crystalline structures called ionic compounds, and sodium chloride is a common example. The next type of molecular bond is a covalent bond, which forms when two atoms share an electron. Electrons from one atom are attracted to both its own nucleus and to the nucleus of a nearby atom. And covalent bonds are stable because they create full outer electron shells in both elements. Covalent bonding we need to talk about a little bit further. One of the things that helps determine covalent bonding is an element's bonding capacity, or the number of unpaired valence electrons. So take a look at hydrogen. It has one valence electron in a shell that can hold two, so hydrogen has one more spot available for a bond and has a bonding capacity of 1. Carbon and oxygen both have outer electron shells that can hold 8 electrons. Carbon has 4 unpaired electrons, so it has a bonding capacity of 4. Oxygen has 2 unpaired electrons, and so it has a bonding capacity of 2. Here's another important aspect of covalent bonds. These bonds are affected by electronegativity, which is a measurement of how much an atom tends to attract electrons toward itself. And I'll give you some examples of covalent polar bonds in a minute. The periodic table shown here indicates the electronegativity of each individual element by the height and color of the column. You don't need to know the numbers in this periodic table, but you should be able to remember which of these 4 main biological elements are most electronegative. You can see that of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, hydrogen and carbon have very similar electronegativity and so are considered to be equally electronegative, whereas nitrogen and oxygen are more electronegative than hydrogen and carbon. If you can keep track of those 4 molecules, you'll be doing pretty well in terms of electronegativity. So here are some examples of covalent bonds that are affected by, first, bonding capacity. Hydrogen has a bonding capacity of 1, so it can form 1 covalent bond with itself, or with oxygen, or with carbon. Oxygen has a bonding capacity of 2, so it can bind to 2 hydrogens, or it can double bond to itself. Carbon has a bonding capacity of 4, so it can bond to 4 separate atoms. Okay, so you can see how bonding capacity determines the shape of the molecule and how many bonds are formed. Also, there is polarity associated with the electronegativity. Here's a water molecule. Can you remember which of these elements, oxygen or hydrogen, is more electronegative? You should relatively quickly remember that oxygen is more electronegative. And when the electronegativity of the elements within a molecule is unequal, the electrons tend to hang out more often by the more electronegative element in the molecule, which means electron tends to hang around here more. This makes this a negative pole of the molecule, and down here is a more positive pole of the molecule. So water actually has polarity associated with it, partial charge. Covalent bonds can vary to being completely nonpolar, to being somewhat polar, or to being very polar. Let's give some examples. Hydrogen, hydrogen, 2 hydrogen molecules in the element molecule hydrogen are equally electronegative, so that's a nonpolar molecule. Oxygen itself is a highly electronegative element, but when bound to another equally electronegative element, it creates a nonpolar molecule. The electron is shared equally. We've already said that water tends to be a polar molecule because the electron hangs out closer to oxygen. And methane, because it consists of both carbons and hydrogens, which are equally electronegative, they share the electron equally, and this makes it a nonpolar molecule. Our last type of bond is a hydrogen bond, which is this shown dotted line here. And it's a weak interaction that forms between the hydrogen of a polar molecule like water and the electronegative atom of another polar molecule. Even though hydrogen bonds are not very strong, there's no actual movement of electrons from one molecule to the other, water is very plentiful, and so the hydrogen bonds that are often associated with water significantly affect many biological interactions. For instance, hydrogen bond forms between water molecules in a solution of water. And this causes water molecules to bond more tightly to each other than they would if they were nonpolar substance. This gives water its properties of cohesion. Water is also an excellent solvent, which means it dissolves polar solids well. Water is attracted to charged molecules or polar compounds like ions and surrounds the individual molecules or ions and separates them from each other. In this figure, which shows sodium chloride with water, notice that the chloride ions, which are negatively charged, are attracted to the polar or the positive poles of water, and the sodium ion, which is positively charged, is attracted to the negative pole of water. Polar molecules and ions tend to interact with water molecules and are thus considered hydrophilic or water-loving. This amino acid serine is a polar molecule with many electronegative atoms in it. You should recognize oxygen and nitrogen. There's another oxygen. It's a very polar molecule. But nonpolar molecules like fats are almost all hydrocarbons, which are not very electronegative and have no charge. There's little attraction with these molecules to water, and molecules like this are called hydrophobic. Okay, we've now covered enough chemistry that we can get back to biology. Here's a cartoon of a cell. You can see that it's full of organelles, but let's look first only at the plasma membrane, the membrane that surrounds it, shown here. This plasma membrane acts as a boundary to the cell and keeps the inside different from the outside. It's even able to separate ions. There's a high concentration of potassium on the inside of a cell and a higher concentration of sodium and chloride and calcium on the outside of the cell. How is it that these separations of ions are maintained? Here's a close-up cartoon of the plasma membrane, and we'll look at all the parts of a plasma membrane later, but first let's just look at this membrane itself that's called a lipid bilayer. Lipid because it's made out of lipids, and bilayer because there's two lipids deep in the membrane. So here's a close-up of a lipid bilayer with the outside and the inside. The outside of a cell is mostly water, and the inside of a cell is mostly water. But notice that the inside of the membrane, shown here, there isn't any water. Now stop and think for a minute about what you've learned about polarity of molecules and hydrophobicity. What does the lack of water here tell you about this part of a phospholipid? You should be suspicious that the tail of a phospholipid is nonpolar. Just carbons, it turns out to be just carbons and hydrogens, which you can see here in ball form, or simplified as just zigzags. In chemical notation, if it's a zigzag, it's a carbon-hydrogen chain, and that's the only molecules present. Remember that carbon and hydrogen bonds are not polar. They're nonpolar covalent bonds. So this tail is nonpolar and hydrophobic. This is why the center of a cell membrane has no water present. On the other hand, the head of a phospholipid has all kinds of electronegative atoms. We see nitrogens and lots of oxygens, all kinds of stuff going on here. This yellow phosphate group with the phosphate and the oxygen molecules around it is negatively charged. And so the head of a phospholipid is polar and hydrophilic. Since water is attracted to the heads, they're found on the outside of a cell membrane. while the nonpolar tails are found in the center away from water. Molecules that have both polar and nonpolar region are called amphipathic. Phospholipids naturally orient themselves into a lipid bilayer. There's no extra force, nothing has to move them into this configuration. Because water is attracted to the heads and water is attracted to other molecules, but not attracted to the tails, this tends to push the tails away from water until the most stable position is that the tails are together away from water, maximizing the ability of water to form bonds with itself. This now creates a barrier for the cell, if this is the outside and this is the inside, that prevents the passage of anything that's polar from getting through the membrane. Sodium ions, for instance, are ionic. They have a charge. They're more attracted to water than they are to the nonpolar part of the plasma membrane, and so they are more likely to not diffuse through the center of the membrane. Oxygen gas, however, is a nonpolar molecule, and so it's relatively small and can pass through the membrane without much difficulty. Okay, so molecules can and can't cross the membrane depending upon their charge. This is a list of the vocabulary words you should be comfortable with before moving forward. And here are some good questions you should know the answers to study for the basics quiz. Thanks for watching.